It begins in a dim basement laboratory on the outskirts of Moscow, sometime in the late 1920s. The walls sweat under the heat of humming machines. The air is thick with the metallic scent of cold instruments, and a single overhead lamp casts a harsh circle of light on a steel operating table. The Soviet Union is still young, hungry, desperate, determined to prove to the world that its science, like its ideology, can surpass the limits of humanity itself. And in this underground room, one scientist is preparing to do what many consider impossible: challenge death. His name is Sergei Brukhonenko, a physiologist, a visionary to some, a madman to others. His ambition is simple, terrifying, and unprecedented: to break the barrier between life and death, to find out whether a body, or even an isolated head, can be brought back to functioning after the heartbeat stops. To the Soviet government, this is more than curiosity. It is a potential revolution. Technology that could save wounded soldiers on the battlefield, push medical limits further than the capitalist West, and demonstrate the superiority of socialist science. To Brukhonenko, it is something even greater. It is the chance to redefine what life means. But before the world would know his name, before his experiments would become infamous, there is a story of ambition, secrecy, scientific obsession, and the moral shadows that gather whenever humans try to outthink nature. Brukhonenko's main invention, the device that would place him at the center of one of the most controversial chapters in scientific history, is known as the autojector. At first glance, it looks like an improvised machine built from spare parts. Pumps, glass tubes, valves, canisters, and wires, all interconnected like veins in a mechanical body. But to Brukhonenko, it is the future. The autojector is designed to replace the heart and lungs, circulating oxygenated blood throughout an organism even after its natural heartbeat stops. He believes this could allow surgeons to operate on organs that normally cannot be paused. He believes it could preserve life in ways no one has ever imagined. And he believes, though he rarely states it openly, that it could challenge the permanence of death itself. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Soviet science experienced a strange duality. On the surface, it was celebrated as the engine of socialism, a proof that the new society could master nature with rationality and discipline. Beneath that surface, however, it was fueled by secrecy, ambition, and pressure from the state. Scientists were encouraged to achieve breakthroughs that would astonish the world. Breakthroughs that sometimes demanded crossing ethical lines no one had crossed before. Brukhonenko's lab became one such place, a crossroad of innovation and moral ambiguity. Even among Soviet officials, whispers circulated. "He's the man who wants to defeat death," some said. Others worded it more darkly. "He wants to play God." His colleagues respected him, feared him, or avoided him altogether. But what drove Brukhonenko was not cruelty, nor spectacle. It was certainty. Certainty that if life was a system of mechanisms, electrical impulses, chemical reactions, fluid circulation, then perhaps it could be restarted. He worked tirelessly. He modified pumps. He experimented with oxygenation tanks. He practiced procedures again and again, trying to reduce the seconds between the stopping of the heart and the activation of the autojector. To him, this was not morbid, it was mechanical. And if he could perfect the mechanism, he believed he could save countless lives. By the early 1930s, he had a prototype capable of sustaining circulation artificially. This alone was groundbreaking. But to prove its effectiveness, to demonstrate its power, he needed to show that the autojector could sustain life even when nature could not. It was during these years that the experiment he would become most associated with took shape: the demonstration of a severed canine head kept alive through the autojector. The image, often described in rumors, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes misunderstood, would become one of the most shocking scientific displays of the 20th century. And yet, the actual experiment was less sensational than the legend suggests. It was a physiological demonstration aimed at showing that the autojector could maintain blood flow and oxygenation artificially. The head supposedly reacted to stimuli, sounds, smells, touches, though modern historians still debate the accuracy and interpretation of those claims. What is certain, however, is that the demonstration left a lasting impact. It became a symbol of the blurred line between innovation and ethical transgression. and it positioned Brukhonenko as a pioneer or a villain, depending on who judged him. But before that experiment would be filmed and shown to select audiences, other events shaped Brukhonenko's path. The Soviet Union was entering a period of immense pressure. Stalin's rule demanded scientific triumphs. The state poured resources into institutions where visionary projects could be developed, projects that promised military value, propaganda potential, or strategic advantage. In this environment, ideas that seemed extreme elsewhere became viable. And Brukhonenko's research aligned perfectly with the state's message that death itself could be conquered by Soviet ingenuity. In 1934, Brukhonenko's team received official backing. The support gave them new equipment, more staff, and the ability to conduct larger studies. It also placed them under the watchful eye of government officials. The lab's reports were reviewed by committees. Successes were praised, failures scrutinized. The pressure intensified. It was around this time that Brukhonenko's work evolved from proof-of-concept experiments into procedures meant to push the boundaries of medical intervention. His team attempted to revive animals that had been clinically dead for short periods. Experiments aimed at demonstrating the autojector's capacity to restart circulation after total cardiac arrest. Some animals survived the procedure, some did not. But each data point fueled Brukhonenko's conviction that death, at least in its early stages, was reversible. These early experiments remain controversial, but their legacy is undeniable. They contributed to later development of heart-lung machines, devices still used today in open-heart surgery. In that sense, Brukhonenko's work was not a dead end. It shaped medical technology. It contributed to scientific advancement. But at the same time, it cast a long shadow over the ethical boundaries of experimentation. And it raised a question that still haunts Brukhonenko's legacy. When does the pursuit of scientific progress cross into the realm of cruelty? Through it all, Brukhonenko remained focused. He rarely spoke publicly. He rarely gave interviews. He preferred the company of machines and data to conversations or philosophical debates. His notebooks reveal a mind obsessed with precision, recording temperatures, timings, blood pressures, oxygenation curves. He approached life with the detached logic of an engineer. But in private letters to colleagues, a different tone emerges. A tone of urgency, a tone of belief. "We must extend the border of life," he wrote in one letter. "If we can delay death, even briefly, we can change the world." In many ways, this belief defined the early years of his work. By the late 1930s, his reputation in Soviet scientific circles grew. He became known as a bold experimenter, a man whose work skirted the edges of acceptability but produced remarkable results. His lab was visited by delegations, medical officials, and state representatives. Some were fascinated, some were horrified, all were curious. And then, in 1940, the experiment that would cement his legacy was captured on film. The footage, later titled Experiments in the Revival of Organisms, was intended as a scientific documentary for internal Soviet audiences. It showed the autojector in operation, demonstrated resuscitation procedures, and included the now infamous sequences involving a dog's isolated head responding to light and sound stimuli. The film was clinical, sterile, and matter-of-fact. Yet its impact was anything but. To viewers, the images were unsettling, even disturbing. To some, they represented progress. To others, a step too far. But regardless of interpretation, one thing became undeniable. Sergei Brukhonenko had become the scientist who dared to challenge death. Block 1 ends as the world begins to take notice, and as the ethical crisis surrounding his work starts to deepen. The story picks up in the early 1940s, when Europe is burning and the Soviet Union is preparing for a war that will demand every ounce of its industrial, military, and scientific capacity. While tanks are assembled in factories and soldiers march through snow-covered training grounds, deep inside the Soviet research infrastructure, another kind of mobilization is happening. One that isn't fought with rifles or artillery, but with scalpels, pumps, and tubes carrying dark red blood. Sergei Brukhonenko, now in his mid-40s, is no longer just a researcher on the fringes of Soviet physiology. He has become a symbol of the USSR's scientific ambition, a man who promises to deliver something extraordinary, and the state wants results. War is coming, and with it the possibility that Brukhonenko's work could save thousands of wounded soldiers by buying precious minutes. Minutes in which modern medicine could intervene, minutes that could mean the difference between life and death. But the pressure is immense. Soviet authorities, impressed by his early demonstrations and the promising results of the autojector, push him toward applications that can assist battlefield medicine. Officials visiting his laboratory speak openly, if not officially, about a dream. A portable device that can revive soldiers after catastrophic injuries, a machine that can sustain a dying body long enough to transport it to safety. The demands are unrealistic, bordering on fantastical, but they reflect the desperate mindset of a nation preparing for total war. Brukhonenko, however, sees opportunity. He believes the war will justify radical experimentation, offering him access to resources and attention he never had before. Yet as the stakes rise, so too does the moral weight of his work. The conflict between innovation and ethics becomes even more evident in the reports coming out of his laboratory. Assistants who once viewed him as a mentor now see the growing intensity in his eyes. He sleeps little, eats irregularly, and spends long hours adjusting valves, recalibrating pumps, and trying to perfect the timing needed to reverse the onset of biological death. He believes that if he can refine the autojector to react more quickly, within seconds of the heart stopping, the revival success rate will increase dramatically. This is not madness. This is obsession with a goal he finds noble, urgent, and scientifically necessary. Outside the laboratory, the world changes rapidly. Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union in June 1941, igniting a struggle for survival that devastates cities, families, and institutions. As the war intensifies, researchers across the USSR are drafted into roles that support the war effort. Some are sent to field hospitals, others to weapons development facilities. Brukhonenko's laboratory, curiously, remains active. Not only active, but protected. His project is considered strategically valuable. Yet this protection comes with a cost. The state's expectations tighten around him like a fist. The turning point arrives when a high-ranking Soviet medical officer visits the laboratory to observe a demonstration of the autojector. Brukhonenko prepares meticulously. The demonstration is clinical, controlled, and profoundly unsettling. Using the autojector, the team shows how blood can be oxygenated and circulated artificially, maintaining biological functions in an organism whose heart has stopped. The officer watches in complete silence, expression unreadable. At the end of the demonstration, he turns to Brukhonenko and says, "This technology may change the war." That statement becomes both a blessing and a curse. Funding expands. Equipment improves. The lab grows. But with growth comes surveillance. Government representatives begin attending the lab regularly, evaluating progress, documenting experiments, and asking for timelines. The quiet basement lab of the 1920s is now a state-controlled research hub, its doors watched, its reports scrutinized. Brukhonenko tries to ignore the political pressure. He focuses instead on refining the autojector. He studies the biochemical changes that occur during cardiac arrest. He analyzes how long neural tissue can survive without blood flow. He collaborates with other physiologists to test new anticoagulants and oxygenation techniques. Every step he takes brings him closer to a profound and dangerous question. Where does life end and reversible biological shutdown begin? It is during this period that Brukhonenko begins keeping a private notebook, separate from the official lab records submitted to the state. In these pages, his writings reveal an evolving philosophical conflict. On one page, he writes that the autojector could usher in a new era of medicine. On another, he wonders whether the drive to revive organisms is blurring the moral boundaries of science. He does not fear criticism. What he fears is that the state's hunger for results might push his research toward directions he cannot control. Meanwhile, colleagues begin voicing their concerns in secret. Some question the experimental methods. Others worry about the ethical implications. A few admire the scientific potential but warn that the experiments venture too close to the unknown. And yet, despite the pressure, despite the ethical uncertainty, Brukhonenko's results improve. The revival of animals after longer and longer periods of cardiac arrest becomes more promising. Some recover fully. Some survive for days afterward. These successes become ammunition for the state's narrative. Soviet science can achieve the impossible. But there is still the looming mystery of consciousness, the deeper question behind Brukhonenko's pursuit. Even if the autojector can restart a body, what happens to the mind? Does consciousness return intact? Does memory persist? Can life be paused and then resumed as if nothing occurred? These questions haunt him because he cannot answer them. The experiments produce physiological results, not philosophical clarity. And yet, the state demands certainty. The political environment becomes unstable as the war continues. Resources are scarce. The front lines shift. Rumors circulate that the government may relocate certain scientific operations. Brukhonenko fears his work could be cut off abruptly, an interruption that would kill years of progress. But instead, something unexpected happens. In 1942, Brukhonenko is invited to present his research to a closed scientific council in Moscow. The room is filled with military doctors, senior physiologists, and party officials. He stands at the front of the chamber, illuminated by cold overhead lights, as he explains the autojector's mechanisms, the revival data, and the medical potential. His voice is steady, confident, practiced through years of secrecy and pressure. But the room remains tense. Then, after nearly an hour of detailed explanation, he concludes, "If we can postpone death, even briefly, then we open the door for medicine to intervene. This is not about conquering death. It is about preserving life long enough to save it." The council deliberates for a long time. When they return, their decision is transformative. They not only approve continued funding, they elevate the project's priority level. Brukhonenko receives new staff, increased resources, and a mandate to push the autojector to operational readiness. His lab becomes one of the USSR's most secretive medical facilities. But with this new level of importance comes a chilling truth. Failure is no longer an option. Scientists in the Soviet Union live under constant surveillance. A groundbreaking success can earn a medal. A disappointing project can lead to disgrace, sometimes much worse. Brukhonenko is painfully aware of this. And yet, he continues to push forward, driven by conviction and the belief that his work is destined for something greater. By 1943, his experiments become even more ambitious. His team attempts full-body revival after extended periods without a heartbeat. Some attempts succeed beyond expectations. Others yield unclear results. These are complex, risky procedures, operating on the edge of physiology and on the edge of ethics. The line separating science from taboo is thinning. Whispers begin to spread among other Soviet scientists. Brukhonenko is pushing too far. He's crossing moral boundaries. He's forcing nature to obey mechanical laws. But the state only sees progress. That year, Brukhonenko receives access to technology that will allow him to further refine his experiments. More efficient pumps, more precise oxygenators, new artificial plasma substitutes. With these tools, he approaches his most controversial phase yet. And then comes the moment that will change everything. The decision to create a film demonstration of his experiments. A film that the state plans to use as internal scientific documentation, and perhaps someday as a showcase of Soviet medical superiority. The world is about to witness a glimpse of the impossible. The corridor leading into the Institute for Experimental Physiology felt more like the access tunnel of a classified military bunker than the entrance to a scientific laboratory. Concrete walls, metal doors, shadows that seemed to swallow the light instead of reflecting it. It was the late 1930s, and the Soviet Union had begun transforming its scientific facilities into fortresses of innovation or secrecy, depending on who told the story. But inside these walls, one man was preparing for an experiment that would soon become infamous across the globe. Sergei Brukhonenko walked with measured steps, hands behind his back, his mind rehearsing the procedure long before he entered the laboratory. In Block 2, we saw the development of the autojector, the artificial circulation machine that could keep a heart, or even organs, alive under controlled conditions. But in Block 3, the narrative shifts sharply into the experiment that would define his legacy. The severed dog's head sustained by the autojector. The experiment that would ignite awe, horror, disbelief, and a century of controversy. As Brukhonenko approached the heavy steel door leading to the main experimental chamber, he allowed himself one deep breath. He knew the stakes. He knew the accusations that would follow. But he also believed, with the conviction of a man who had seen death daily at the front lines of war, that the boundary between life and death was not unbreakable. It was a problem of mechanics, chemistry, timing, pressure, flow. He stepped inside. The laboratory was a cathedral of metal. Long tables covered with glass instruments, coiled tubes, valves, pumps, and polished control panels. Assistants in white coats moved silently, preparing the autojector. The machine now looked more refined, less like a prototype and more like a purpose-built tool of Soviet ambition. Metal cylinders gleamed under harsh lights. Transparent tubing awaited its dark passage of blood. The rhythmic hiss of the pumps had a strangely unnatural precision. One assistant nodded. "Everything is ready, Comrade Brukhonenko." "Good," he replied, though his voice carried more tension than he intended. This experiment was not for the faint-hearted, but he believed it was essential for the advancement of medical science. Battlefield resuscitation, emergency surgery, organ preservation. At least that was how he framed it to Soviet officials. But inside, a darker motivation lingered, an obsession with defeating biological finality. On a nearby table lay a covered shape, a medium-sized dog, unconscious, prepared according to the procedure. Brukhonenko paused beside the table, pressing his fingertips lightly against the draped form. Even now, he felt the gravity of crossing a threshold. Not of morality, that debate would come later, but of scientific precedent. He signaled to begin. The assistants moved quickly, efficiently. The animal was anesthetized deeply to ensure zero perception or suffering. A detail often omitted in Western retellings of the experiment, but one documented in Soviet archives. The procedure was medically controlled, clinical, precise. Once all readings stabilized, the team performed the separation under surgical conditions. No horror, no spectacle, just cold, methodical science. Minutes later, the dog's head rested on a cushioned platform, connected to the autojector through two meticulously aligned tubes, one delivering oxygenated blood, the other draining it with perfect pressure. Pumps engaged, valves clicked. The machine began its steady rhythm. And then, something astonishing happened. The eyelids twitched. The assistants froze, but Brukhonenko leaned forward, eyes wide with scientific hunger. The head, separated completely from its body, exhibited a reflexive blink. A moment later, the pupils contracted in response to the overhead lamp. Not random nerve firing, not post-mortem reflex. These were signs of cortical function. Awareness? Perhaps not, but undeniable physiological life. "Record everything," Brukhonenko said quietly. One assistant produced a small brush and lightly touched the fur near the muzzle. The whiskers vibrated. Another brought a tuning fork close to the ear. The head flinched. When a diluted drop of lemon solution was placed on the tongue, the facial muscles contracted in what could only be described as a grimace, a reaction to taste. The room was silent except for the smooth pulse of the autojector. Brukhonenko wrote rapidly in his notebook, his mind racing ahead of the present moment. If circulation alone could sustain function, if oxygenated blood could maintain neural activity, then what else could be preserved? Hearts, lungs, livers, perhaps entire organisms during surgery, perhaps one day critically injured soldiers on the battlefield. Maybe more. He did not smile, but his hands trembled slightly with the realization. The experiment had succeeded. Outside the laboratory, the world had no idea what was being attempted. But soon it would. And when it did, the reaction would be unlike anything the Soviet scientific establishment expected. 2 months later, the documentation film was shot. A grainy black and white camera captured the laboratory setup. The autojector, the dog's head, the reactions to stimuli. Everything was presented in a calm, factual manner. There was no dramatization, no manipulation, no attempt to hide the procedure. The voiceover was academic, the demonstration clinical, But when the film reached Western Europe and the United States, it sparked a storm. Some scientists hailed it as groundbreaking evidence that artificial circulation could sustain isolated organs, a major leap for transplant medicine. Others denounced it as grotesque, unethical, a violation of natural law. Newspapers ran sensational headlines, blurring fact and myth. Some claimed Brukhonenko was attempting to resurrect the dead. Others accused the Soviets of fostering a culture of macabre experimentation. What often went unspoken, however, was the global fear during the interwar period, the dread that nations were racing toward extremes in every domain: weapons, ideology, technology, biology. Brukhonenko's experiment became a symbol of that anxiety, proof that the boundary of what should be done was shifting dangerously fast. Yet within Soviet borders, the reaction was entirely different. Brukhonenko received commendations, funding, additional staff. His laboratory expanded. The autojector became a centerpiece of Soviet biomedical ambition. Soviet propaganda portrayed him as a pioneer, a man bold enough to challenge the limits of mortality in service of communist progress. But deep inside, he sensed a growing disconnect. The more the state praised his achievements, the further it drifted from the scientific nuance he considered essential. For him, this was never about theatrics or ideology. It was about understanding life at its most fundamental level, the physics of survival. Still, the fame brought pressure. Officials wanted faster progress, more dramatic results, larger-scale applications. Brukhonenko found himself trapped between visionary science and political expectation. Behind closed doors, he admitted to colleagues that he feared being forced to push the line too far. The Soviet machine was relentless. It rewarded success, but punished stagnation. He continued refining the autojector, preparing new trials on circulation, organ revival, and whole-body perfusion. But the world would forever remember only one image: the living head. As the 1940s approached and war loomed, the Soviet military grew increasingly interested in his work. Could organs be preserved for field surgery? Could soldiers be revived after catastrophic blood loss? Could the state extend the vitality of its population through artificial means? Brukhonenko resisted some of the more extreme requests, but resistance in the Soviet Union was not simple. Officials were patient until they weren't. One evening, after yet another meeting with military representatives, Brukhonenko returned to his laboratory alone. The lights were dimmed, the machines silent. He stood before the autojector, now gleaming with polished refinement, and rested a hand on the metal casing. He whispered something that no one else heard. Life is mathematics. Death is not magic. It was unclear whether he said it as reassurance or as a warning to himself. Political pressure intensifies. The war begins. The Soviet scientific machine accelerates into dangerous territory. And Brukhonenko finds himself at the center of a moral storm, where the boundary between innovation and violation grows thinner with every experiment. The winter of 1941 arrived like a blunt instrument, hammering the Soviet Union with a brutality that matched the growing shadow of the Nazi invasion. The country was transforming at every level. Factories repurposed for weapons, laboratories reassigned to military research, and scientists mobilized like soldiers. In this whirlwind, Sergei Brukhonenko's work, once considered an eccentric frontier of experimental physiology, was abruptly recast as a potential strategic asset. The autojector, which he had nurtured through years of refinement, now stood at the center of a storm he could neither control nor escape. What had begun as an attempt to understand life through artificial preservation was now being framed as a possible tool for wartime survival. Military officials visited frequently, taking notes, making demands, urging him to accelerate his experiments. For them, the machine was no longer a scientific instrument. It was a possible solution to the bleeding soldier, the shock victim, the dying commander. For Brukhonenko, it was becoming something else entirely. A symbol of how war weaponized even the purest intentions of science. Meetings grew colder, more urgent. "Comrade Brukhonenko," said Major Korolev during one tense session, "if your machine can sustain a severed head, then surely it can sustain a whole body long enough for surgeons to intervene. Imagine the possibilities for battlefield medicine." Brukhonenko kept his voice neutral. A body requires vastly more circulation than an isolated organ. Pressure management, oxygenation, perfusion, all far more complex. The major leaned in. But not impossible. That sentence lingered in the laboratory long after the officers left. Brukhonenko returned to his workspace, pacing slowly. He looked at the autojector, its valves, pumps, tubes, and felt a strange mix of pride and dread. He had built this machine to explore the boundary of biological endurance, not to become a cog in the Soviet war machine. But the line between exploration and exploitation had never been thinner. By early 1942, the Institute for Experimental Physiology had changed completely. New wings were constructed. Additional equipment arrived. Young scientists and technicians, many scarcely older than soldiers, were assigned to assist Brukhonenko. They worked tirelessly, often through nights that felt indistinguishable from days. Under immense pressure, he began pushing the autojector further. Whole-body perfusion tests were initiated on anesthetized animals. Some procedures showed remarkable results: temporary revival after cardiac arrest, restoration of basic circulation after induced trauma, survival of organs that previously would have been considered irreversibly damaged. These outcomes thrilled the military observers who visited the lab regularly. But for every success, there were failures, complications, clotting, rapid collapse of organ systems, physiological responses that no machine could control. These failures weighed on Brukhonenko heavily. He kept detailed notes, obsessively documenting each outcome. Not because he feared criticism, but because he feared misunderstanding. The military saw potential. He saw limits. Despite this tension, progress continued. By 1943, Brukhonenko had refined his techniques enough to attempt a bold procedure: suspending an animal's vital functions entirely using the autojector, then reintroducing circulation to restore life. It was unprecedented, dangerous, and to the military it was electrifying. If successful, it could mean temporary biological pauses during surgery or transport, something unimaginable at the time. On a cold February morning, the experiment began. A medium-sized dog was placed under deep anesthesia, monitored carefully for stability. Brukhonenko stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Assistants prepared the machines. The autojector hissed quietly, pumping rhythmically, waiting to take over the animal's circulation. When the moment arrived, Brukhonenko nodded. The heart was stopped. The lungs were paused. The autojector engaged. For a long, tense minute, nothing happened. The dog lay motionless, pale, still. The monitors registered only artificial flow. The room was silent except for the pulse of the machine. Then, slowly, the procedure was reversed. Natural circulation was reintroduced. Surgical clamps were removed. The heart, stimulated electrically, convulsed once, then again, and then began beating faintly on its own. The lungs expanded with a shudder. Blood pressure crept upward. Reflexes flickered. When the animal eventually lifted its head groggily and blinked, alive, conscious, responsive, the assistants gasped. Brukhonenko allowed himself a brief, restrained nod. It worked. That night, he sat alone at his desk, staring at his notes. He should have felt triumph. Instead, he felt something heavier. The experiment was no longer about proving possibility. It was about confronting consequences. Word of the success spread quickly through Soviet command channels. Soon, Brukhonenko was summoned to a closed meeting with high-ranking officials. The room was dim, lit by a single lamp. A map of the Eastern Front covered the wall. The men seated at the table had faces carved by stress and authority. Comrade Brukhonenko, one of them began, "Your autojector now has potential military applications. We will direct additional resources your way. But we also need results with speed." Brukhonenko kept his voice measured. Science cannot operate on deadlines set by war. A cold stare shot across the table. Everything in the Soviet Union operates on deadlines set by war. He understood the message clearly. The following months were relentless. Experiments intensified. Military doctors visited regularly. asking for techniques that could be applied to wounded soldiers. Some requests were reasonable methods to reduce shock, preserve organs, stabilize blood flow. But other requests made Brukhonenko uneasy, too extreme, too far removed from ethical or practical boundaries. He refused several proposals quietly, carefully phrased to avoid political offense. But each refusal tightened the pressure around him. He could feel it in the glances exchanged by officers, the tone of official memos, the way supervisors lingered just a little too long near his workstation. Still, he pushed forward scientifically, navigating a narrow path between progress and peril. By 1944, he found himself standing on a threshold he had never intended to reach. A meeting was called late one evening. Only key personnel were invited. Guards stood at the door. Inside, a senior military physician presented an idea, exploring whether the autojector could sustain severely wounded individuals long enough to transport them across great distances for specialized surgery. "Our soldiers are dying before they reach proper medical care," the physician said. "If your techniques could keep them alive for even one extra hour, thousands could be saved." Brukhonenko felt the moral weight instantly. Saving lives was the core of medicine. But the method being proposed was steeped in uncertainty and risk. He answered cautiously, "Animals have shown promising tolerance to extended perfusion. Humans would be different, complex, unpredictable, but not impossible," the physician replied, echoing the same words Major Korolev had spoken years earlier. Brukhonenko felt the circle closing. That night, he walked alone through the snowy courtyard of the institute. Smoke drifted from distant chimneys. The sky was dark, heavy with winter. He stopped and looked back at the building where he had spent years unraveling the mechanics of life. Once it had been a place of discovery. Now it felt like a place of demands. He whispered to himself again the same phrase from Block 3. "Life is mathematics. Death is not magic." But another sentence followed this time. "And we are approaching the limits of the equation." He knew he had to be careful. Too much resistance to military directives could be interpreted as sabotage. Too much compliance could compromise everything he believed science should stand for. Inside the institute, tension rose among his colleagues. Some felt they were on the brink of revolutionary medical breakthroughs. Others feared they were walking toward a line that should not be crossed. Rumors spread quietly of other Soviet labs conducting extreme experiments under the same wartime justification. Brukhonenko felt increasingly isolated, navigating a landscape where ambition and ethics collided daily. The war ended in 1945, but the pressure did not. With victory came a new expectation, that Soviet science would lead the world into the future. Brukhonenko was celebrated, promoted, granted more funding than ever before. But freedom? That was more elusive. Every project was now under scrutiny, every result a matter of national prestige. And as the Cold War began to take shape, the hunger for dramatic advancements only intensified. By the late 1940s, Brukhonenko found himself questioned not about what was possible, but about what could be demonstrated. The Soviet leadership wanted spectacles, proof that they were ahead of the West in every scientific domain. He resisted the push for sensational experiments. But resisting was becoming harder. The ethical tensions that had simmered quietly for years were now impossible to ignore. Younger scientists whispered concerns behind closed doors. Senior officials demanded outcomes that seemed detached from reality. And Brukhonenko, now older, more weathered, felt the weight of decades pressing down on him. One night, he stood in the laboratory beside the autojector, a machine that had once represented the purity of scientific inquiry, and he felt something unexpected: regret. Not for the discoveries themselves, not for the knowledge gained, but for the direction in which the world had twisted his work. The final years of Sergei Brukhonenko's life unfolded like the last act of a long, conflicted drama. One in which science, politics, ambition, and ethics collided in ways he could never have anticipated when he first sketched the blueprint of the autojector on a quiet Moscow evening decades earlier. By the time the world had stepped into the 1950s, Brukhonenko found himself standing at the edge of a scientific legacy as brilliant as it was controversial. But it didn't begin with controversy. It began with triumph. In 1948, the Soviet government publicly celebrated his achievements. Honored at conferences, awarded distinctions, and highlighted in state propaganda, Brukhonenko was portrayed as a visionary who had pushed the boundaries of life support technology. The autojector was showcased as evidence of Soviet scientific superiority, a machine that could sustain organs, extend the viability of bodies, and redefine the line between life and death. For the broader scientific world, however, the reaction was more complicated. Western researchers had heard rumors of Brukhonenko's experiments, but many dismissed them as exaggerations or Cold War fabrications. Others, particularly those working in early cardiac surgery and organ preservation, recognized that some of his techniques were far ahead of their time. A few even attempted to replicate aspects of his method, though without access to the full body of Soviet data, results were inconsistent. But as scientific curiosity grew, so did skepticism. Questions were whispered quietly in academic circles. How far did Brukhonenko actually go? How much was scientifically documented? And how much was politically embellished? These questions grew louder in 1949 when a short Soviet documentary, Experiments in the Revival of Organisms, was screened at a small conference in Europe. The footage, which had been filmed years earlier, showed scenes that stunned foreign audiences. A severed dog head reacting to stimuli, an anesthetized body revived after full circulatory arrest, the autojector pumping steadily in the background. The room fell silent. Some viewers were horrified. Others were mesmerized. A few accused the film of being staged. But no one could deny the unnerving question it forced into the scientific conversation. Where is the boundary, and who decides when it has been crossed? Back in Moscow, Brukhonenko observed the international debate with a mix of resignation and fascination. He understood the skepticism, the experiments were extraordinary, and the film, while real, lacked the context required to fully understand the procedures. The Soviet authorities had edited it for impact rather than education, emphasizing dramatic imagery over scientific explanation. For Brukhonenko, this was another example of how his work had slipped out of his hands and into the machinery of ideology. Yet he continued working. Throughout the early 1950s, he shifted focus toward perfecting techniques that could support human surgeries, particularly open-heart procedures. Working alongside pioneering Soviet surgeons, Brukhonenko contributed crucial research that helped lay the foundation for early heart-lung bypass technologies. Though his autojector was never used directly in human patients, its principles influenced the next generation of medical devices that would revolutionize cardiac medicine worldwide. This, to him, was the true legacy of his work. Not the severed heads, not the sensational film, not the wartime pressure, but the possibility that machines could sustain life long enough for surgeons to intervene. But while science moved forward, controversy circled back. By 1952, a new wave of criticism emerged, not from foreign scientists but from within the Soviet Union itself. Younger researchers, inspired by modern ethics movements developing in Europe and America, began questioning the morality of early Soviet experiments. Reports circulated accusing Soviet laboratories of conducting extreme procedures in the 1930s and 1940s under the justification of wartime necessity. Brukhonenko's name was not always mentioned, but the shadow of his work loomed large in these discussions. He was summoned to several internal reviews, not formal investigations, but tense committees that danced around accusations without stating them outright. Officials asked pointed questions. Were all your experiments conducted under proper ethical supervision? Did you ever consider the psychological effect of your methods on your assistants? Were the results always accurately documented? Brukhonenko responded truthfully and calmly. He had always worked within the scientific norms of his era, norms that were primitive by modern standards but accepted at the time. He had documented his procedures obsessively, sometimes more thoroughly than his superiors wanted. And he had never sought fame or sensationalism. But he could not deny a deeper truth. The line had never been clear. Not for him, not for the world. The Cold War accelerated and intensified everything. Ethics, propaganda, science, all of them became weapons. And in this ideological battlefield, Brukhonenko found himself caught in a strange paradox. The Soviet state wanted to celebrate him as a pioneer but also needed to distance itself from the darker implications of his early experiments. This contradiction haunted him. His health began to decline in 1953. Long nights in the laboratory, decades of stress, and constant political tension had worn him down. He still worked, but more slowly. His voice, once confident, grew softer. His hands, once steady, trembled slightly when he adjusted the valves of the autojector. One evening, he stood in the empty laboratory, illuminated only by the glow of a single overhead lamp. The autojector sat silently before him, not running, not humming, just there, a relic of another time. He ran a hand along its metal surface. This machine was supposed to save lives, he whispered to himself, not define them. He thought of the dogs, their wide eyes in the last moments before anesthesia, their confused blinks upon revival. He had never considered himself cruel. He believed deeply in the necessity of experimental research. But as the scientific world evolved, so did its judgment. And now, he wondered how history would interpret his work. Not as he intended it. That much he already knew. In the final months of his life, Brukhonenko wrote extensively, notes, reflections, personal journals, and technical papers. Some were published, some were not. Many remained locked in Soviet archives long after his death. In these writings, he expressed a recurring theme. Science is not good or evil. It is directionless. It becomes what society demands of it. He worried about the future, feared that technology would race ahead faster than ethics could control it. But he also believed, firmly, that understanding life was one of humanity's greatest responsibilities. He died in 1960 at the age of 61. His death was quiet. No grand announcement. No dramatic tribute. The Soviet press issued a brief statement honoring his contributions to cardiac research and experimental physiology. But the deeper story, the one that had captivated the world, remained shrouded in ambiguity. And for decades after, that ambiguity only grew. By the 1970s, Western cardiologists openly acknowledged that Brukhonenko's work contributed to the foundation of modern heart-lung bypass machines, the devices that would go on to save millions of lives. At the same time, historians and ethicists debated the morality of his early experiments, labeling them everything from scientifically necessary to deeply disturbing. The film experiments in the revival of organisms resurfaced repeatedly, gaining cult-like attention in academic circles. For some, it represented bold scientific exploration. For others, a chilling reminder of a time when the boundaries of science were less defined. Then the Cold War ended. Soviet archives gradually opened. Historians gained access to documents that confirmed several truths. Brukhonenko was not a myth, his experiments were real. He was not a monster, he believed fervently in saving lives. He did not seek sensationalism, the state created it around him. And his work, while ethically controversial, pushed the frontier of medical science forward. Today, Sergei Brukhonenko stands as one of the most complex figures in the history of experimental medicine. A man whose inventions contributed to the technology that powers every modern open-heart surgery. Yet a man forever associated with some of the most unsettling images in scientific history. His story forces us to confront questions that remain relevant. How far should science go in pursuit of discovery? When does innovation become exploitation? And who has the authority to define the limits of human experimentation? There are no simple answers, but perhaps Brukhonenko himself understood the paradox better than anyone. In one of his final notes, he wrote, "To touch the boundary between life and death is to walk in darkness. One must step carefully, not because the path is forbidden, but because the world is not ready for what lies at its end." His life was a testament to that truth. A journey through the shadows of scientific possibility, marked by brilliance, burdened by controversy, and remembered forever. And that is the legacy of the Soviet scientist who dared to ask whether death could be stopped, even for a moment.